At my grandson's 1-month celebration, I brought a wooden horse I had spent weeks carving by hand. Walnut wood, sanded until it felt like silk. No paint, no plastic, just the smell of the forest and the work of a man's hands. My daughter-in-law tossed it aside like it was nothing. My son laughed and said, "He's just a carpenter, babe." I picked it up quietly and left. The next morning, I called my lawyer. His secretary went pale. "You need to come in right now. He's here." That was the moment everything started to shift. The late afternoon sun of a Saturday in October did not simply shine through the floor-to-ceiling windows of the Harrogate Club. It interrogated everything it touched. It caught the hard edges of the crystal chandeliers, the exact placement of the white lilies, and the polished sheen on the faces of 65 guests. This was a room built for people who never had to check the price tag of their own dignity. I stood at the entrance for a moment, holding a bundle wrapped in heavy, unbleached canvas. It felt heavy in my arms, not because of its weight, but because of the hours I had poured into it alone in my garage. It was a wooden rocking horse, carved from walnut, smooth as silk beneath the fingers. No glossy paint, no plastic shine, just timber, patience, and labor. The room smelled like expensive perfume and catered salmon. It was a cold smell. "Dad, you're here," Danny said. He did not come over to hug me. He stopped a few feet away instead, drink in hand like a shield. His eyes flicked to the wrapped bundle in my arms, and for the briefest second, I saw a flash of something that looked like unease. "You could have just left the gift at the front desk with the others," he said. "They're organizing them by size." "I wanted to carry it," I answered. My voice sounded like gravel dragged across silk in that room. He did not argue. He only nodded toward a table at the far end of the hall where Serena was seated. She looked like a porcelain doll in a dress that probably cost more than my first truck. Beside her sat Maggie Whitfield, her mother, presiding over the event like a queen mother at a coronation. I walked through the crowd. No one looked directly at me, yet I felt every eye in the room recording the same details. My suit was 10 years old. My hands were still stained with wood oil no matter how much I scrubbed them. In that room, those details mattered more than character. When it came time for the gifts, the air changed. It became a performance. Serena opened designer baby clothes, silver rattles from Tiffany's, high-tech monitors that looked expensive enough to track a heartbeat from the moon. Every box was met with a chorus of admiration, soft gasps, polite laughter, approval. Then it was my turn. I stepped forward and pulled away the canvas. The rocking horse stood there on the velvet tablecloth, looking completely out of place, like a timber wolf in a kennel of poodles. I had carved the mane to look like it was caught by the wind. I had spent 3 nights on the eyes alone. "It's walnut," I said. "For the boy." Serena lifted it with both hands. She never studied the craftsmanship. She never tested the balance of the rockers. She held it for maybe 3 seconds, then gave a smile that did not reach her eyes, the kind of smile a person gives a waiter who brought the wrong order. After that, she set it down on the far edge of the table. "How rustic," she murmured. Maggie Whitfield reached over. She did not even pick it up. She touched one carved wooden ear with 2 fingers, the way a person might touch a piece of trash left on a porch. She said nothing, but her face said enough. It said the object was dirty. It said it did not belong in the nursery of a Whitfield heir. The silence in the room stretched. Then Danny stepped beside his wife. He looked at the horse, then at the guests, then finally at me. He did not look like my son in that moment. He looked like a man who had scrubbed his past clean and suddenly found one stubborn stain he could not remove. "Honestly, Dad," Danny said, loud enough for every corner of the Harrogate Club to hear, "we have a specific aesthetic for the nursery. We're not running a pioneer museum. Maybe next time just stick to the registry. It would save everyone the awkwardness." A few people chuckled. Most looked away, embarrassed maybe, or bored. It is hard to tell the difference in a room full of polished people. I did not explain that the walnut came from the tree in the backyard of the house where Danny had learned to ride a bike. I did not defend myself. I did not need to. I stood there, then sat back down for 10 more minutes. I watched them move on to the next gift, a motorized baby cradle that cost $4,000. No one spoke to me. No one offered me a drink. To the 65 people in that room, I had become part of the furniture, and not the expensive kind. Then I stood up. I walked to the gift table. I did not look at Danny. I did not look at Serena. I picked up the wooden horse, wrapped it back in the heavy canvas, and tucked it under my arm. Then I walked out of the Harrogate Club. Even the valet moved slowly when I handed over my ticket, sensing I was not the kind of man who tipped $20 for a 30-second drive. I sat behind the wheel of my Ford while the engine idled rough beneath me. The rocking horse rested on the passenger seat. Its wooden eyes faced the dashboard. I did not cry. I did not even feel the urge. I pulled out of the lot and started driving home. My mind drifted away from chandeliers and perfume. It moved instead toward the study in my house, toward the fireproof steel cabinet bolted to the floor years ago, hidden behind old winter coats. Nobody in that ballroom knew what was inside that cabinet. Danny certainly did not. To him, I was exactly what he had announced to the room. A retired carpenter with nothing left to give except rustic toys. I looked at the horse one last time before turning onto the main road. "Pioneer Museum," I whispered to the empty truck. Then I kept driving. And for the first time in years, I started planning. The overhead bulb flickered as the aluminum garage door rolled upward, washing the concrete floor in pale yellow light. The smell of pine dust and motor oil hit me the moment I stepped out. It was a sharp, honest smell. A clean one. Nothing like the sterile perfume I had swallowed all afternoon. I carried the canvas bundle inside, unwrapped it, and lifted the rocking horse into both hands. I placed it back on the third shelf above the workbench. It settled perfectly into the faint circular ring of clean sawdust where it had sat for 3 straight weeks before today. Inside the house, the silence felt different. It was not the suffocating silence of a banquet hall full of judgment. It was the deep, settled quiet of a home that had seen extraordinary love and devastating loss. I stepped into the kitchen and filled the kettle. Making black tea at 10 o'clock at night had been my habit for 30 years. It kept my hands busy when my thoughts became too loud. As the water heated, my eyes moved to the framed photograph on the windowsill. Carol. She had been gone since 1998. Still, there were mornings when I woke expecting to hear her footsteps on the hardwood floor. She had been only 36 when lung cancer tore through her. We were young then, a small family. We did not have the kind of gold-plated corporate health insurance that shields people from ruin. In America, getting critically ill without the right paperwork is often a financial death sentence. The radiation treatments drained our savings within months. Then came the chemotherapy. Then the lines of credit. Then the second mortgage on this house just to keep her comfortable near the end. When her heart finally stopped, she left behind a shattered husband, an 8-year-old boy, and a mountain of medical debt waiting at the door. I still remember the night after we buried her. Rain came down in a cold, relentless November sheet. I tucked Danny into bed and told him his mother was finally resting without pain. Then I walked out to the garage, sat down on an overturned paint bucket, and stared at the walls. My pockets were empty. The collection agencies were already circling. I picked up a steel framing hammer and held it in my palm, feeling the cold weight of it, wondering how a man with a high school diploma and calloused hands was supposed to keep a roof over his grieving son's head. That night could have broken me. It breaks a lot of men, but I made a different choice. I did not reach for a bottle. I did not run. I gripped that hammer until my knuckles turned white and made a silent promise to the empty room. I was going to survive. I was going to build something for my boy no matter how many hours it took. And I did. For 26 years, I drove my truck to Crestfield Senior Village 5 days a week, rain or shine. I clocked in at 5 in the morning and clocked out at 2 in the afternoon. I was the head maintenance carpenter for a community of 90 elderly residents. I fixed sagging doors, replaced corroded copper pipes, built custom oak shelving for widows who missed the homes they had left behind. To the corporate administration, I was just a reliable hourly employee. To the residents, I was something else entirely. They baked me pies. They asked about my son's grades. They called me our Bob. It was honest work, hard work, the kind that wrecks your joints and stains your hands forever. No one there ever looked at my faded flannel shirts and confused me with a millionaire. The kettle whistled and pulled me back. I poured the water into a mug and walked to the counter. Then I opened the top drawer, the one stuffed with mismatched silverware, old hardware store receipts, and loose batteries. I reached to the back and took out a faded Polaroid. It showed Carol standing in the front yard, holding a gap-toothed, laughing Danny. I traced my thumb over his little face. Back then, he had looked at me like I was a hero. To that child, his father could fix anything. I set the Polaroid beside my tea and stared down the dark hallway. At the end of it stood the solid oak door to the storage room. It had been a long time since I had walked into that room. Longer still since I had unlocked the old metal cabinet waiting inside. The hallway was dark, but I did not need a light. I already knew the way. As I moved toward the storage room, my mind pulled backward through time. The flawless walnut horse in my garage suddenly felt wrong. The first one had not been like that at all. The first one had been born from desperation. It was the dead of winter, about 3 months after we buried Carol. Frost covered Crestfield City, but the real freezing lived inside our house. 8-year-old Danny had become a ghost. He stopped talking. He pushed food around his plate until it went cold. He spent his afternoons staring out the living room window, waiting for a car that was never coming back. I took him to Dr. Miller, the pediatrician who had known him since birth. The doctor was kind, but firm. He told me this was profound childhood depression brought on by severe trauma. He said Danny needed time, stability, routine, an anchor to hold on to while the storm passed. But Dr. Miller could not tell me how a father, drowning in his own grief, was supposed to build an anchor out of nothing. I did not understand psychology. I did not know how to navigate damaged emotional terrain. The only thing I knew how to do was shape solid things with my hands. One bitter night in February, unable to endure the silence any longer, I went out to the freezing workspace and switched on a single bare bulb. My breath drifted white in the air. I bypassed the standard lumber and went to the back corner, where a massive weathered block of old-growth pine rested beneath a tarp. It had belonged to my father, Henry. He had been a stoic man, a factory line worker who spoke mostly through action. Before a sudden stroke took him years earlier, he handed me that block of timber and said he was saving it for something important, even if he never figured out what. That night, I finally did. I hoisted Henry's pine block onto the bench, grabbed my tools, and went to work. The freezing silence broke under the rasp of steel biting into raw wood. The smell of fresh pine filled the garage, fighting the stale scent of oil and dust. I never drew a blueprint. I just cut, chiseled, scraped, drove all the grief in my chest into the timber. Hours disappeared. Sometime around 3 o'clock in the morning, my chisel slipped. A splinter drove deep beneath the thumbnail of my left hand. Blood welled instantly and smeared across the pale wood of the horse's unfinished mane. I did not stop. I wiped my hand on my jeans and kept carving. By the time the gray dawn crept through the frosted window, it was done. It was not elegant. It was rough, chunky, a little crooked. The proportions were off, and the dark stain on the mane was still faintly visible. I carried it inside with aching joints and trembling hands. I opened Danny's bedroom door as quietly as I could and placed the crude pine horse on the rug beside his bed. Then I stepped back into the doorway and waited. 20 minutes later, he stirred. He rubbed his eyes, sat up, looked at the floor. Then he stared. Very slowly, he climbed out of bed and touched the rough wooden ears. And then, after 90 agonizing days, the corners of his mouth twitched. He smiled, a fragile, real smile. the first joy I had seen on his face since we lost her. Standing in the doorway with my bleeding thumb throbbing, looked up at the ceiling and whispered, "Okay, Carol, I know what to do." The memory faded as my hand closed around the brass knob of the storage room door. I was back in 2024. The room smelled like dust, paper, and stale air. I moved past stacked boxes and a broken vacuum until I reached the back wall. There it stood, the heavy olive-drab fireproof filing cabinet. I slipped my hand into my pocket and pulled out a small brass key I had not used in years. As my fingers touched the steel lock, I heard my father's voice again. Henry, sitting on the porch decades ago, pipe in hand. "Son, what do you want to leave behind after you're gone?" I inserted the key. The tumblers gave way with a loud final clack. I pulled the drawer open. It slid out with a long metallic groan, releasing the trapped scent of old paper and dry air. A narrow beam of hallway light reached into the cabinet's top tier. Inside sat a precise row of thick manila folders, 41 of them. Each held a stamped, notarized warranty deed. They were arranged in perfect order, alphabetized by county and zoning district across the state. Beside the real estate files were binders packed with monthly statements for tax-free municipal bonds and a highly diversified portfolio of blue-chip equities. The bottom drawer held the corporate shell itself, state-certified articles of organization for an entity called RBC Holdings LLC, Robert B. Calloway. That was the invisible architect. That was me. I reached inside and lifted several folders, not because I needed to review the numbers. I knew the math by heart. I touched them because every page carried history. That commercial lot in the valley had been bought with the overtime I worked during the record-breaking blizzard of 2004. The downtown apartment complex came from years of flipping bank foreclosures while surviving on 3 hours of sleep, my hands bleeding beneath work gloves. Every deed in that cabinet had been paid for in sweat. As I moved the files, my fingers brushed a single heavy stock document hidden in a protective sleeve at the very back of the drawer. I pulled it into the light. It was not a title, not a stock certificate either. I studied the embossed seal and formal type for a long, quiet moment, tracing the raised ink with my thumb. That one page carried more weight than all the concrete, acreage, and account statements combined. Without opening it fully, I slid it back into place. If a forensic accountant had totaled the current market value of everything resting inside that cabinet, the number would have landed somewhere around $34 million. An empire built entirely in silence, penny by penny, nail by nail, from the wages of a maintenance carpenter at Crestfield Senior Village. For 26 years, I told no one. I pushed the drawer shut. The latch caught with a hard, undeniable click. Then I let myself slide down the wall and sit on the floorboards. The pressure in my chest was not physical exhaustion. It was the crushing gravity of the weapon I had spent decades forging, and the certainty of what it was about to do. Across the room, a small framed picture of Carol hung slightly crooked near the doorway. I looked up at her face in the gloom. "My love," I whispered, my voice cracking just once. "Our son is living his whole life on the estate of a man he absolutely despises." I closed my eyes. It's time. The following morning, long before the sun even considered rising, I woke with an entirely new routine alive inside my bones. The momentum that had carried me through one freezing night of sheer survival in my late 30s now pulled me straight into the spring of 2000. I was 40 years old, running on coffee and focus. If I wanted to build a fortress around my son, a weekly maintenance paycheck was never going to pour that concrete. During a lunch break at the senior center, another tradesman mentioned a ruined, foreclosed property in the Millbrook district. Most investors avoided that neighborhood. Empty storefronts, overgrown lawns, houses nobody wanted. The bank was desperate to unload a specific 2-bedroom unit for $58,000. The very next morning, I walked into Crestfield Community Bank and sat across from Paul Dreer, the branch manager. Paul was a practical man. He respected steady employment, clean credit, and hands that looked like they had done real work. I laid 6 years of carefully hoarded savings on the table and asked him to finance the rest. He looked at my worn boots, then at my pristine credit score, and slid the paperwork toward me. That Millbrook house was a wreck. The roof leaked, the drywall rotted, the plumbing was shot. I had no money for a crew, which meant I had to become the crew. That was when I met Gene Mallister. Gene was a retired, foul-mouthed general contractor, spending his final years behind the counter of an independent builder supply yard on the edge of town. He had no patience for fools, but if you bought your lumber and copper piping from him, he would sketch out electrical schematics and plumbing layouts on the back of torn receipts. He taught me structural load, permit strategy, the ugly arithmetic behind building code. Gene was a chain-smoking professor in work boots, and his hardware store became my university. I did not do it alone. Danny was 10 years old then, all elbows and oversized denim overalls, and he became my right-hand man. We spent weekends inside that ruined house. While other boys his age played video games or went to amusement parks, my son learned how to sort galvanized nails and tape off baseboards for paint. There were Sunday nights when I carried him asleep to the truck, his small face streaked with drywall dust after passing out on a drop cloth in a half-finished living room. Back then, he loved the grime. He loved being part of the process, but he never saw the paperwork. Every deed, every mortgage document, every corporate filing went through the name RBC Holdings, a name I never once explained to him. As the years passed and Danny built his own life, I never corrected his assumption that the Millbrook house had simply been sold off. Some foundations stay strongest when nobody sees them. 7 months later, the Millbrook property was finished. I rented it to a mechanic and his family. Their monthly payment covered the bank loan, the taxes, and left me exactly $112 in profit. A tiny number, almost laughable, but it was enough to spark a fire. I took that equity back to Paul Dreyer and bought a second rundown property 3 years later, then a third. My strategy was painfully slow, but it was mathematically inevitable. While other men upgraded trucks or took cruises, I kept wearing the same threadbare flannel jackets. If my boots started leaking, I patched them with roofing tape. Every spare dollar got shoved right back into real estate. By the time Danny graduated college in 2012, I owned 15 units. By early 2020, that number had reached 35. Then the pandemic hit, and the entire economy seized up. Panic tore through the rental market. Corporate landlords started mailing out eviction notices like machine fire. I chose a different road. I sat at my kitchen table, called every family living in one of my properties, and told each of them the same thing. Keep your money for groceries. Nobody is losing a home. We will sort it out when the dust settles. For those 2 years, I did not raise rent by a single cent, and not one family walked away from a lease. Through all of it, I never quit my day job. I still clocked in at 5 in the morning and fixed leaky faucets for the elderly. Danny, already climbing the corporate ladder by then, used to beg me to retire. He was embarrassed by what I did for a living, but he did not understand the truth. Wealth cannot teach a man dignity. Only labor can do that. I still remember the evening I finished the first Millbrook house. The trim was painted a crisp white. The yard was cleared. A line of hydrangeas sat by the porch. I stood across the street, exhausted to the marrow, staring at a dead structure I had dragged back into life with my own hands. I looked up at the twilight sky and imagined Carol standing next to me. I knew she would have been proud. The decades that followed blurred together in escrow papers and building inspections. By late 2020, I was back in Paul Dreyer's office, signing the closing documents for my 40th property. Paul had silver in his hair by then, and when he shook my hand, disbelief sat openly on his face. As I stood to leave, my eyes landed on a glossy brochure pinned to a corkboard near his door. It was not a duplex, not an apartment complex. This was something else. Prime commercial acreage. A different class of asset entirely. I read the bold black name on the flyer, and my breath caught. That moment yanked me backward to a sweltering July afternoon in